Why was a Norwegian silver coin, minted between the years 1067 and 1080, unearthed from the soil of an ancient Native American settlement in the state of Maine, nearly 1,000 kilometers south of the only confirmed Viking outpost in the New World? And how is it that ice cores drilled from the heart of the Greenlandic ice sheet show a sudden and dramatic cooling event that began almost to the year when the first dragon-headed longships scraped their keels upon the shores of a continent that was not supposed to exist? History, you see, is not a clean, linear narrative. It is a messy affair filled with ghosts and whispers, with stories that begin in fire and end in silence. And in the vast silent library of forgotten worlds, one chapter remains stubbornly unread, its pages brittle with frost and stained with old blood. This is the story of an America discovered 5 centuries before Columbus. A story not of triumph, but of a grand, terrifying, and ultimately doomed experiment. It is the story of the Norsemen in Vinland, and their disappearance is not merely a historical footnote. It is a warning. The first longship did not arrive on a wave of heroic ambition. It was pushed by desperation. The men who stood on its deck, squinting at the unfamiliar green coastline, were not conquerors in the grand European tradition. They were exiles, farmers, and second sons, men from a world of rock and ice, a society perched on the very edge of the known world in Greenland. Their leader, Leif, son of Eric the Red, was following the ghost of a rumor, a tale told by a lost merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course years before and had seen a land of trees to the west. For a Greenlander, a land of trees was a paradise beyond imagining. Their world was a place where driftwood was a treasure, where timber for a single longhouse was the work of generations. The sagas call this new land Vinland, the land of wine, for the wild grapes they found growing in abundance. But this name, so full of promise and bounty, was a lie from the very beginning, a poet's flourish for a land that was anything but gentle. The first impression was one of overwhelming, almost suffocating life. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, was a stark contrast to the sterile, wind-scoured landscapes of Greenland. The forests were impossibly dense, ancient and silent. And in that silence there was a palpable presence. They were not alone. The first encounter was not with a welcoming party. It was with a people they would come to call skrælingar. It is a word of contempt, likely meaning wretches or screamers. It was a fatal mistake from the first breath. To name a people is to define your relationship with them, and they chose a name born of fear and arrogance. The sagas are brutally honest about what happened next. Thorvald, Leif's brother, led a later expedition. Finding 9 natives sleeping under their skin-covered canoes, the Norsemen, without provocation, without a word exchanged, slaughtered 8 of them. One escaped, a single man who would become the messenger of a war that would span generations and consume the Viking dream. They had crossed an ocean to find a paradise, but they brought their own hell with them. The response was not long in coming. A fleet of native canoes descended upon the Vikings' ship, a swarm of silent, vengeful ghosts. They unleashed a storm of arrows, and one found its mark, piercing Thorvald under the arm. As he lay dying, he looked out at the beautiful, hostile shore and uttered the first European prophecy on American soil. "This is a rich land we have found. There is plenty of fat around my entrails. We have won a fine and fruitful country, but we shall have little joy of it." He asked to be buried there, with a cross at his head and another at his feet, forever claiming a piece of the land that had claimed him. The first blood had been shed, and the soil of the New World drank it greedily. It was a poison that would contaminate every interaction, every hope, every desperate attempt to carve out a life in this beautiful, terrible place. The real enemy was not the arrow that flew from the shadows of the forest. It was the darkness they had carried in their own hearts across the vast, indifferent ocean. So what was the Vikings' first and perhaps most critical mistake? Was it their violence, the unprovoked attack that turned curiosity into a blood feud? or their arrogance, the simple act of naming an entire people wretches before ever learning their true name? Tell us your choice in the comments. The answer may reveal more about us than it does about them. The darkness they carried in their hearts found its perfect crucible in the fledgling settlement that would later be known as L'Anse-aux-Meadows. Here, on a windswept terrace in what is now Newfoundland, they built their foothold in the New World. From the air, the reconstructed turf-walled longhouses look like scars on the green earth, a testament to a fleeting, violent dream. This was to be the capital of Vinland, a base for exploration, a lumber camp, and a gateway to the untold riches of an entire continent. The archaeological evidence tells a story of incredible industry. The remains of a smithy, charcoal kilns, and workshops for repairing ships speak of a community determined to make this alien world their own. They smelted iron from local bog ore, a monumental task, producing hundreds of nails to hold their world together. For a brief, shining moment, it must have felt like a success. They had survived the ocean, they had established a home, and they were surrounded by resources beyond the wildest dreams of any Greenlander. But the New World did not unite them, it merely gave their old demons a larger stage. History rarely teaches, but it always cruelly punishes for lessons not learned. The greatest threat to L'Anse-aux-Meadows came not from the forest, but from within its own turf walls. The saga of the Greenlanders tells the story of Freydis Eiriksdottir, Leif's sister, a woman who embodied the raw, untamable ambition of her lineage. She was illegitimate, a fact that likely fueled a burning desire to prove herself worthy of the name Erik the Red's daughter. She proposed a joint expedition to Vinland with two Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, agreeing to share the profits equally. It was a partnership doomed from the start. Freydis, from the moment they landed, began to sow discord. She was a master of manipulation, playing on old rivalries and deep-seated insecurities. She felt slighted, cheated, and disrespected by the Icelanders. The tension simmered through the long, claustrophobic winter in the close quarters of the longhouses. The air grew thick with suspicion. Every shared glance, every whispered word became evidence of conspiracy. The paradise of Vinland had become a pressure cooker of paranoia. Imagine the scene, a handful of Europeans, thousands of miles from anything they could call home, surrounded by a hostile wilderness and an equally hostile native population. Their only hope for survival lay in unity, in the bonds of kinship and shared purpose. Yet they turned on each other with a ferocity that would have made the skrælings pause. Freydis went to her husband Thorvard and wove a tale of insult and assault at the hands of the Icelandic brothers. She claimed they had beaten her and demanded that he avenge her honor. When he hesitated, she delivered her ultimatum: "I shall divorce you if you do not avenge me." She had cornered him, using the complex codes of Norse honor as a weapon. What followed was not a battle, but a calculated, cold-blooded execution. Thorvard and his men stormed the Icelanders' longhouse in the grey light of dawn, tying up the sleeping men and leading them out one by one to be slaughtered. But when it came to the 5 women in the house, his men refused. Their code, brutal as it was, drew a line at the murder of women. It was at this moment that Freydis revealed the true, chilling depths of her nature. "Hand me an axe," she said, and with her own hands she butchered the 5 women who had shared a winter with her, their only crime being their association with the men she had condemned. This was not just a crime of passion, it was a business decision. With the brothers and their crew dead, all the profits, all the lumber, all the furs from the expedition belonged to her. This was the first civil war fought by Europeans on American soil, a private, squalid affair that took place 750 years before the Battle of Fort Sumter. It was a massacre born of greed and pride, a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of human nature when stripped of the constraints of society. Freydis swore her men to silence, promising death to anyone who spoke of what had happened. They sailed back to Greenland, their ship heavy with timber and lies. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of rising to the surface. Leif Erikson eventually heard the truth, and though he could not bring himself to punish his own sister as she deserved, a curse was said to have fallen upon her and her descendants. The true curse, however, was not supernatural. It was the simple, brutal fact that a community so willing to devour itself could never hope to survive in a world that demanded unity above all else. The blood they spilled that winter morning seeped into the foundations of Vinland, poisoning the dream before it had ever truly begun. The war that mattered was not against the skrælings, it was a war against themselves, a war they had already lost. The blood that soaked the floorboards of the longhouse at Lonso Meadows was a chilling omen. While the Norsemen were busy settling their internal feuds with axes, the true owners of the land were watching, learning, and adapting. The war with the skrælings, which had begun with a skirmish and a single death, was about to escalate into a conflict that would define the very existence of the colony. It was a war of shadows, a clash not of armies, but of philosophies. On one side stood the Vikings, products of a European military tradition that valued pitched battles, shield walls, and the psychological impact of iron and steel. They were formidable warriors in the open field, a terrifying force of disciplined destruction. On the other side were the indigenous peoples, whose approach to warfare was as fluid and unforgiving as the landscape itself. They were not a single entity, but a collection of different groups, likely the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk peoples, or perhaps even the last remnants of the ancient Dorset culture, a people who were themselves being displaced by newcomers. To the Vikings, they were all just skrælings, a faceless, howling mob, but to themselves, they were the defenders of a world under invasion. Their warfare was one of ambush, of hit-and-run raids, of using the dense forests, winding rivers, and foggy coasts as their greatest allies. They understood that to fight the Norsemen on their own terms was suicide. So they refused. They became ghosts in the trees, whispers on the wind. They would strike a foraging party, melting back into the woods before a shield wall could even be formed. They would attack at night, using fire and terror to sow chaos within the settlement's walls. The sagas describe one particularly harrowing encounter. A great host of skrælings attacked the settlement, armed with a strange new weapon, a large, dark, ball-like object mounted on a pole, which they swung and launched at the Norsemen. It made a terrifying, hideous noise as it flew through the air, striking the ground and causing panic among the Vikings, who broke and fled. It was likely a form of catapult, a sophisticated piece of siege weaponry that shattered the Norse assumption of technological superiority. In that moment of terror, as disciplined warriors broke rank and ran for their lives, the psychological balance of the war shifted forever. The Vikings were no longer the invincible Iron Men from across the sea. They were trespassers, vulnerable and afraid. They had the better swords, but the skrælings had the better strategy. They were fighting a war of attrition, and it was a war the Norsemen, with their limited numbers and fragile supply lines, could not possibly win. Every tree felled for their longhouses, every animal hunted for its pelt, every fish pulled from the river was an act of theft in the eyes of the land's inhabitants. The Vikings were not settlers. They were a persistent, consuming blight. Could you have maintained your humanity, watching the world around you crumble? What would you sacrifice first, your honor or your survival? The Norsemen tried to fight back. They mounted expeditions, pushing up rivers and along the coast, seeking to strike at the heart of their unseen enemy. But they were like a man trying to punch the fog. The deeper they went into the continent, the more lost and vulnerable they became. Every narrow channel could hide an ambush. Every bend in the river could conceal a war party. The very landscape, which had once seemed so full of promise, now felt like a vast green trap, slowly closing around them. The psychological toll was immense, the constant gnawing tension of knowing you were always being watched, the fear of leaving the relative safety of the settlement walls, the paranoia that saw an enemy in every shadow, a threat in every snapped twig. This was not the glorious warfare of the sagas, of duels between champions and the clash of steel on steel. This was a dirty, nerve-shredding guerrilla war, a war of exhaustion that drained not only their resources but also their will to continue. Superior weapons win battles, a superior understanding of the world wins wars. The Norsemen had only the first. They were fighting not just a people, but an entire ecosystem that had turned against them. They could win every single skirmish, kill 100 skrælings for every one of their own they lost, and it would not matter. They were an island of iron in an ocean of wood and stone, and the tide was inexorably rising against them. Some must have realized the futility of it all. They were too few, too far from home, and too deeply hated. The dream of Vinland was dying, not in a blaze of glory, but through a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. The War of Shadows was a war they were destined to lose, pushing some to wonder if safety lay not in fighting, but in fleeing even deeper into the heart of the unknown continent. The relentless pressure on the coastal settlements may have forced some groups to make a desperate gamble, to push inland, away from the War of Shadows and into the vast, uncharted interior of the continent. This is where the story of Vinland dissolves from history into a landscape of myth, controversy, and haunting artifacts. It is a world of ghost stories and stones that speak in riddles. The most famous and most controversial of these is the Kensington Rune Stone. Discovered in 1898 by a Swedish immigrant farmer in rural Minnesota, this 200-pound slab of greywacke is covered in runes that tell a harrowing story. The inscription speaks of a party of 8 Goths, or Swedes, and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey west from Vinland. It describes how 10 of their men were found, red with blood and dead, by a lake, a 10-day journey from their ship. The stone is dated to the year 1362, a full 3.5 centuries after Leif Erikson's landing and more than a century before Columbus. For decades, the stone has been at the center of a furious academic war. To its proponents, it is the final, tragic message of a lost Viking expedition, a stone of sorrow left by men facing annihilation thousands of miles from the sea. To its detractors, it is a clever but obvious 19th century forgery, created to bolster a sense of Scandinavian pride in the American Midwest. The linguistic arguments are complex, the runes themselves showing forms that are both archaic and anachronistically modern. Yet the story it tells is undeniably compelling. Imagine that small band of Norsemen, their ship left far behind on the shores of Hudson Bay or one of the Great Lakes. They are pushing through a landscape utterly alien to them, a world of sprawling forests and endless prairies. Why were they there? Were they searching for a fabled northwest passage back to Greenland? Were they fleeing the escalating war with the skrælings on the coast? Or were they simply driven by that insatiable Norse curiosity, the desire to see what lay beyond the next horizon, even if it led them to their doom? Another set of enigmatic clues are the Beardmore relics, a collection of Viking-era artifacts, including a sword, an axe head, and a rattling device allegedly found in Ontario, Canada, in 1931. Like the Kensington Stone, their provenance is shrouded in mystery and accusations of fraud. Yet if they are genuine, they paint a picture of Norsemen penetrating deep into the heart of North America, following the great waterways that served as the highways of the indigenous peoples. These lost expeditions, if they existed, were on a one-way journey into oblivion. They were cut off from their own world, a tiny fragment of medieval Scandinavia adrift in a Stone Age sea. Their iron weapons would have eventually broken, their Norse language would have faded over generations, and their genes would have been diluted and absorbed into the vast pool of the native populations. Their story would not have ended in a final, glorious battle. It would have ended with a whimper, with the last man who remembered the sagas dying of old age in a native village, his stories of ice-covered lands and dragon-proud ships becoming just another strange legend in the tribe's oral history. They were ghosts long before they died. The journey of such a lost group would be an epic of survival against impossible odds. Every day would present a new challenge, navigating unfamiliar terrain, hunting unknown animals, and encountering new tribes who might be hostile or hospitable. What is scarier, the axe of an enemy you can see, or the slow, silent certainty of being forgotten by the entire world? Their quest was not for glory or riches, but for a path back to a world that may have already forgotten them. They were a living anachronism, their fate a haunting testament to the immense, unforgiving scale of the continent they had so brazenly entered. Their legacy is not written in the grand annals of history, but in these scattered, disputed clues, a carved stone, a rusty sword, the faint, ghostly traces of a dream that had turned into a nightmare of endless wandering. Now let's imagine you are an archaeologist. You unearth an iron sword in a context that suggests it is from the 14th century in the middle of North America. Do you risk your career by declaring it evidence of a lost Viking expedition, challenging the entire historical consensus, or do you classify it as a later trade item, a safer but perhaps less truthful conclusion? Your choice in the comments will reveal your appetite for discovery. The ghostly trail of these lost expeditions fades into the continental vastness, but for the main colony clinging to the coast, a far more tangible and terrifying enemy was gathering its strength. This was an enemy against which iron swords were useless, an enemy that could not be fought, only endured. It was the climate itself. The entire Norse venture into the North Atlantic, the colonization of Iceland, the settlement of Greenland, and the leap to Vinland had been made possible by a remarkable period of unusually warm weather known as the medieval climate optimum. For several centuries, the seas were less choked with ice, the growing seasons were longer, and the hayfields of Greenland could support a thriving population of cattle and sheep. The Vikings were not just skilled sailors, they were lucky. They had ridden a wave of favorable climate across the ocean. But the climate is a fickle god. Around the year 1300, this period of grace came to a sudden and catastrophic end. The Earth's orbital cycles shifted slightly, volcanic activity spewed sun-blocking aerosols into the atmosphere, and the intricate dance of ocean currents changed its rhythm. The planet began to cool. This was the dawn of the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift that would reshape history across the globe. For the Norse colonies in the North Atlantic, it was a death sentence delivered from the heavens. In Vinland, the winters, already harsh, became monstrously long and brutal. The summers grew short and cool, making it difficult to grow even the hardiest of crops. The wild grapes that had given the land its optimistic name may have withered on the vine. Game animals, struggling to survive themselves, would have become scarcer or migrated away. The sea, their highway, and their larder became a treacherous enemy. Pack ice, once a seasonal nuisance, now choked the bays and fjords for much of the year, making fishing and travel perilous, if not impossible. A single, abnormally harsh winter could trap a community, cutting them off from their hunting grounds and sealing them in a tomb of snow and ice. The fight against the elements became an epic, daily battle. Imagine the sheer, soul-crushing labor of trying to stay alive, the endless chopping of wood to feed the fires in the longhouse, the desperate hunts in blinding blizzards for any scrap of meat, the gnawing, ever-present hunger that set neighbor to eye neighbor with a new, terrifying kind of appraisal. This was a war they could not win. They were a people of the sea, and the sea had turned against them. Worse still, the Little Ice Age was strangling their lifeline, Greenland. The Greenland colony, the crucial stepping stone between Vinland and Europe, was dying. The hayfields failed, the cattle starved, and the harbors froze solid. The once proud descendants of Eric the Red were reduced to a desperate, isolated community fighting for its own survival. They could no longer send ships with supplies, reinforcements, or news to their cousins in Vinland. The umbilical cord had been severed by the ice. The colonists in Vinland were now truly, utterly alone, trapped on the edge of a hostile continent with an increasingly hostile climate at their backs and a silent, frozen ocean before them. There is a special kind of terror in realizing you have been abandoned, not just by your own people, but by the world itself. The gods they had worshipped, the gods of thunder and war, seemed to have fallen silent, replaced by a new, implacable deity of ice and cold. The struggle for Vinland was no longer a human drama of war and exploration. It had become a primal story of survival against a planetary force, a story written in frostbite, starvation, and the profound, deafening silence of a world freezing around them. The stab in the back had come not from a skrēling arrow, but from the sky itself. This climatic catastrophe transformed their new world from a land of opportunity into the most unforgiving prison imaginable. The ice that was slowly crushing the life out of the Vinland settlement was also choking the sea lanes of the entire North Atlantic. The silence of the ocean became the colony's death knell. The connection to Greenland, once a semi-regular, if perilous, voyage, became a journey into a frozen hell. The last ships to attempt the passage would have faced conditions unimaginable to their ancestors. They would have battled monster storms, navigated through fields of icebergs the size of mountains, and risked being trapped for months in the crushing grip of the pack ice. The journey became a suicide mission. The Greenland colony itself was fading into obscurity. The once thriving settlements withered. Archaeological evidence from the final years of Norse Greenland paints a grim picture of a society in terminal decline. The bones of the last Greenlanders show signs of severe malnutrition. They had resorted to eating their own dogs. Their finely crafted European tools were replaced by cruder implements made of bone and stone. They were slowly losing the technology that had set them apart. They were forgetting who they were. In Europe, the memory of this distant, icy outpost was already transforming into legend. The great catastrophes of the 14th century, the Great Famine, the 100 Years' War, and above all, the Black Death, turned Europe's attention inward. The plague wiped out as much as half the population of Norway, the Greenland colony's mother country. Who could spare a thought for a few hundred farmers on a frozen island at the edge of the world when death was stalking the streets of every city from Oslo to Naples? The engine of the Norse expansion had run out of fuel. The combination of demographic collapse and economic ruin in Scandinavia meant there were no more people, no more resources, and no more political will to support these far-flung colonies. Vinland, which had always been a rumor to most Europeans, was forgotten entirely. The last official record mentioning Greenland comes from a papal letter dated 1448, which speaks of the island's inhabitants suffering from constant attacks by pagans. After that, for nearly 300 years, there is only silence. The death of a civilization is rarely a single, dramatic event. It is a slow, quiet process of fading away. It is the ship that never arrives. It is the letter that is never answered. It is the memory that dims with each passing generation, until it becomes a half-remembered fairy tale told by a fireside. We can imagine the story of the very last ship to attempt the journey from Greenland to Norway, a vessel seeking aid that would never come. It would have been a ghost ship before it ever left port, crewed by a handful of gaunt, desperate men. The voyage would have been a relentless catalogue of horrors. Men would have died from starvation, from sickness, from the sheer, soul-crushing despair of staring out at an endless, empty, ice-strewn ocean. One by one they would have succumbed, their bodies committed to the cold, dark water, until only a few remained, too weak even to manage the sails. The ship, now adrift, would have become their floating coffin, a silent testament to a severed connection, a forgotten world. The knowledge of an entire continent, a prize of unimaginable value, was lost. It did not vanish in a single cataclysmic event. It simply seeped away through the cracks of a world consumed by its own problems. The Vikings had touched America, shed blood on its soil, and built homes under its sky, and then Europe simply forgot they had ever been there. It is one of the most astonishing facts in human history. A continent was discovered and then undiscovered, lost to the mists of time and the indifference of a world that had moved on. The silence of the ocean was the final verdict on the Viking dream. This inexorable slide into isolation brings us to the final agonizing question. What happened on the last day? How did the Norse presence in the New World, this bold, bloody, century-spanning experiment, finally end? Did it end with the thunderous clash of a final battle, a heroic last stand against overwhelming odds? Or did it end with the quiet creak of a departing longship, a silent admission of defeat? The archaeological evidence at Lanceau Meadows is maddeningly ambiguous. The site shows no signs of a massive, violent confrontation. There are no mass graves filled with the dead, no layers of ash and charcoal suggesting the settlement was burned to the ground. The end, it seems, was not a fiery apocalypse. Instead, the evidence points to an orderly, perhaps even hasty, departure. The site appears to have been deliberately abandoned. Valuable items that could be carried were taken. Heavier or less essential objects were left behind. The turf longhouses were left to slowly collapse back into the earth from which they were built. This lack of violence has led many to believe that the end was not a military defeat, but a strategic withdrawal. The remaining colonists, worn down by decades of relentless warfare, crippled by a changing climate and utterly cut off from the rest of their world, may have simply made a calculated decision. They looked at their dwindling numbers, their failing resources, and the increasingly hostile world around them, and concluded that the Vinland experiment had failed. The dream was over. Survival meant going home, or at least trying to. This scenario is a tragedy of a different kind. It is not the heroic tragedy of the warrior, but the quiet, heartbreaking tragedy of the pioneer, admitting that the wilderness has won. Imagine the tension of that final day. The frantic packing of the longships, the careful rationing of the last meager supplies for the perilous journey back to a Greenland that might not even exist anymore. The last looks back at the turf houses that had been their homes, at the graves of their children and comrades buried in this alien soil. They would be leaving behind not just a settlement, but the accumulated hopes and failures of generations. It was the end of a world. But there is another darker possibility. Perhaps the archaeological silence is misleading. A final, decisive battle might not have happened at the main settlement, but could have caught the last of the Norsemen out in the wilderness, in a foraging party, or a smaller, more remote outpost. A united force of skrælings tribes, having learned the Vikings' tactics and weaknesses over the course of a century, could have orchestrated a final, annihilating blow, a perfectly executed ambush from which there was no escape. This scenario would leave few traces for archaeologists to find. The victors would have carried off the valuable iron weapons, and the northern forest would have quickly and efficiently reclaimed the bones of the vanquished. In this version of the end, the last Norseman in America did not die of old age or sickness. He died with a stone axe in his chest, his last sight the faces of the people he had wronged, his last sound their triumphant screams echoing through the silent, ancient trees. The sagas themselves offer a final, cryptic clue. The saga of Eric the Red ends its account of the Vinland voyages by simply stating that Karlsefni, one of the last major expedition leaders, returned to Greenland and then to Iceland, and that, after that, there was no more talk of a Vinland voyage. Just like that, the subject was closed, the dream was put away. So what do you believe happened to the last Vikings in Vinland? Was their end a strategic retreat, a pragmatic but heartbreaking admission of defeat? Or was it a final annihilation, a swift and brutal end at the hands of the people they could never conquer? Leave your theory in the comments. The truth remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The mystery of the colony's end on American soil is profound, but what if some did not die and did not leave? What if the last chapter of the Vinland saga was not one of death, but of assimilation? What if the last Vikings did not vanish, but simply ceased to be Vikings? This is the search for ghosts in the blood, the hunt for a genetic and cultural legacy left behind in the indigenous populations of the Northeast. For centuries, tantalizing stories have emerged from the oral traditions of tribes like the Mi'kmaq and the Algonquin. Legends of fair-haired, pale-skinned magicians or warriors who came from the sea. Some tales speak of men with beards, a facial feature rare among indigenous American populations, who wielded weapons that could cut down trees. Are these just myths, or are they the distorted, time-worn memories of a real historical encounter, of Norsemen who, either by choice or by force, were absorbed into the native world? A single Viking or a small group, finding themselves cut off from their own people, might have had only one path to survival: to join a native tribe. They would have had to abandon their language, their religion, and their identity, but their skills in metalworking and carpentry would have made them valuable assets. Over generations, their European features would have diluted, their stories of Odin and Thor would have blended with local mythologies, until all that remained was a puzzling family story about a strange, light-haired ancestor from long ago. The search for these genetic ghosts has moved from the realm of legend to the cutting edge of science. Modern geneticists are now able to scan entire genomes for traces of ancient admixtures. So far, the search for a clear pre-Columbian European genetic signature in the DNA of mainland North American indigenous groups has been inconclusive. The continent is vast, populations have moved and intermingled for centuries, and finding a definitive genetic signal from 1,000 years ago, left by a tiny population, is like finding a single needle in a continent-sized haystack. But the most stunning piece of genetic evidence comes not from America, but from Iceland. A landmark study conducted by Decode Genetics in Iceland discovered a specific lineage of mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mother to child, that appeared to be of Native American origin. This C1e lineage, as it is known, has been found in about 80 Icelanders, all descending from a single woman who must have lived in Iceland around the year 1700. At first, it was thought she might have been a later arrival, perhaps an Inuit woman brought back by Danish traders. But further research has pushed the probable arrival date of this genetic line back closer and closer to the Viking Age. The implication is staggering. Sometime around the year 1000, a Norse ship returning from Vinland must have carried a Native American woman back with them. Was she a captive, a slave, a curiosity? Or was she perhaps the wife of a Norseman, a diplomatic bride from a brief period of peace between the two peoples? We will never know her name or her story. But this single, silent woman carried a genetic message from the New World to the Old 5 centuries before Columbus. Her children and her children's children became part of the Icelandic population, their American ancestry completely unknown to them until the tools of modern genetics revealed their secret origin. This discovery flips the entire narrative on its head. It is not just about the Vikings leaving their mark on America, but about America leaving its mark on them. It tells us that the interaction was not just one of violence, but of complex human relationships that we can no longer see. The story of Vinland is not just a tale of men with swords, it is also the story of a single, unnamed woman whose bloodline has survived for 1,000 years, a living, breathing link between two worlds that were supposed to be separate. The ghosts of Vinland are not just buried under the soil of Newfoundland, they may be walking the streets of Reykjavik today. The story of the forgotten continent and its ghostly genetic traces remained locked in the realm of myth and saga for 900 years. For centuries, Vinland was nothing more than a fantastical tale, a story for long winter nights, dismissed by serious historians as folklore. The 19th century saw a surge of romantic interest in all things Viking, a Viking mania that swept across Scandinavia and the American Midwest. This period produced a flurry of enthusiastic amateurs and outright forgers, all claiming to have found proof of a Viking presence in America. From the Kensington runestone to a supposed Viking tower in Newport, Rhode Island, the landscape became littered with false leads and wishful thinking. The academic world, weary of these sensational claims, became deeply skeptical of the entire notion. The sagas were literature, they argued, not historical records. To find Vinland, they said, was to chase a phantom, It would take two people with an almost fanatical belief in the sagas and an iron will to turn that phantom into a fact. Their names were Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad. Helge was a Norwegian explorer and writer, a rugged adventurer who had lived as a trapper in the Canadian North. Anne Stein was an archaeologist, a meticulous and brilliant scholar. Together they formed a perfect team, combining Helge's intuitive understanding of landscape and exploration with Anne Stein's rigorous scientific discipline. They were convinced that the sagas were not just stories but practical navigational guides, filled with accurate descriptions of coastlines, landmarks, and travel times. Starting in the 1950s, they began their quest. For years, they methodically searched the coasts of Rhode Island, Nova Scotia, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, investigating every promising inlet and river mouth. It was a frustrating, often hopeless task. They battled skeptical locals, dismissive academics, and the unforgiving North Atlantic weather. They followed countless dead ends, excavating sites that turned up nothing but disappointment. Many would have given up. But the Ingstads were possessed by a singular conviction. They believed the key lay in a single cryptic phrase from the sagas describing Leif Erikson's base camp. In 1960, following a tip from a local fisherman in Newfoundland, they arrived at a small, windswept bay called Lance aux Meadows. On a grassy marine terrace overlooking the sea, they saw a series of faint, overgrown bumps in the ground. To an untrained eye, they were nothing. To Helge and Anne Stein, their shape was electrifyingly familiar. They resembled the faint outlines of ancient Norse longhouses they had seen in Greenland. The excavation began in 1961. As Anne Stein and her team carefully peeled back the layers of turf, the history of a lost world emerged into the light of the 20th century. They found the stone foundations of 8 buildings, their layout unmistakably Norse. They unearthed a smithy, complete with a stone anvil and traces of smelted bog iron. And then came the moment of absolute, irrefutable proof. A bronze, ring-headed pin of a classic Viking design, an object that could only have been made in medieval Scandinavia. In that moment, 9 centuries of doubt and dismissal were swept away. The myth of Vinland was true. They had found it. The discovery at Lance aux Meadows was one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. It rewrote the history books, proving conclusively that Europeans had reached the Americas 500 years before Columbus. It was a triumph of perseverance, a testament to the power of a single-minded quest driven by the belief that the old stories held a deep and literal truth. The Ingstads' race was not just against time and the elements, it was a race against forgetting. They had reached back across nearly a millennium of silence and shaken hands with the ghosts of Vinland, forcing the modern world to finally acknowledge the story it had so long chosen to ignore. The return from myth was complete, but the rediscovery of this lost chapter of history opened up a new and far more profound set of questions. The rediscovery of Lance aux Meadows was a triumph, but it also forced a difficult reckoning. The story of the Vikings in America is not a simple tale of heroic discovery. It is a cautionary tale, a parable whose warnings echo with chilling relevance in our own time. They stood on the shores of a new world, armed with what was, for their era, overwhelming technological superiority. They had iron weapons, ocean-going ships, and a warrior ethos that had carried them across half of Europe. And yet they failed. They were defeated not by a superior army, but by a combination of their own fatal flaws, their arrogance, their inability to adapt, and their short-sighted exploitation of a world they did not understand. They arrived in Vinland not as immigrants seeking to become part of a new world, but as conquerors seeking to impose the rules of their old one. Their first instinct upon meeting a new people was not to learn, but to dominate, to label them as wretches, and to answer curiosity with violence. They saw the vast forests not as a complex ecosystem to be respected, but as a warehouse of timber to be harvested. This failure of imagination, this inability to see the world through any eyes but their own, was their ultimate undoing. They won their battles, but they lost the war because they never understood the nature of the war they were fighting. Their story is a prototype for countless colonial tragedies that would follow. It demonstrates a timeless and brutal truth: a civilization that cannot adapt is doomed to perish. Their collapse was a perfect storm of social, environmental, and cultural failures. Their internal conflicts, epitomized by Friday's bloody massacre, shattered the unity they needed to survive. Their guerrilla war with the skrælings bled them dry, a constant drain on their manpower and their morale. And the final, decisive blow was delivered by the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift they could not have foreseen, but which was exacerbated by their own precarious position at the very edge of the sustainable world. They had pushed their luck too far, and the laws of nature and history finally called in their debt. Today we stand on the threshold of new Vinlands. We look to the depths of our own oceans, to the surface of Mars, and to the stars beyond, driven by that same ancient human impulse to explore, to expand, to see what lies over the horizon. We possess technology that would seem like magic to the Norsemen. We can cross the void of space, communicate instantly across the globe, and unlock the very secrets of life itself. But have we truly learned the lesson that was written in blood and ice in Newfoundland 1,000 years ago? The Vikings lost because they tried to conquer a new world instead of becoming a part of it. When we encounter new environments, new challenges, new forms of life, will we repeat their mistake? The ghosts of Vinland whisper a warning: technological power without wisdom is a form of suicide. Their saga is not just history, it is a mirror, and in it we can see our own reflection. So as we stand on the cusp of our own age of discovery, we face the same fundamental choice they did. Are we destined to be masters, imposing our will upon new worlds until they, or we, break? Or can we learn to be students, approaching the unknown with humility, respect, and a willingness to adapt? Write your answer in the comments below, for the next chapter of the human story has yet to be written.